BLOCKTV, it's time now for HODL with Heddle, a chance for us to zoom out for a moment and take a wider perspective on some of the heady issues that dominate the crypto markets as a whole. And of course, to guide us on this journey of discovery, we're joined as usual by Bitcoin influencer and thought leader, Dan Hell, Director of Business Development at Kraken. Dan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so this was certainly an interesting week. Some have said historic in the history of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies as a whole. We've seen the massive price spike that occurred, some say in the wake of comments from Chinese President Xi Jinping. But before we get too into the minutiae and the different details, Dan, what do you make of all this? What do you make of all this action, this volatility, and everything we've seen in the last week?
Well, things have been very exciting. Bitcoin moved up 40% or nearly 40% in one day. And that is the third largest upside swing ever in Bitcoin's history. The other two times, I think it happened before 2013. So that was actually before I got into it. So for me, that was a very exciting moment. In our last episode, we talked about the origins of HODL with Heddle, where, HODLing is about believing in something and choosing to invest in it. And this 40% move shows that HODLing with Bitcoin is definitely worth it. I believe that Fundstrat and a few others did an analysis of what it means to HODL. And Bitcoin produces most of its return, I believe, like 1 out of every 30 days or so. So you really have to HODL, you really have to believe during these days where it's flat or down, because these 40% price movements actually dictate the outcome of Bitcoin far more than the average, 1% to 2% moves do on a daily basis. So I think, this was a good and kind of important and really close reflection of why HODLing pays off. And, why did the price move 40%? That's always a tricky question. I think a lot of people like to prescribe a narrative to the price movement. We could say that certainly there were, geopolitical events around the Chinese president saying that blockchain was a priority. And the basis of that theory is that if the president declares that blockchain is a priority, then it will become unavoidable for the Chinese population to then learn about Bitcoin. So that's how I've heard it interpreted, is that blockchain is good for Bitcoin here because you kind of have to start with Bitcoin before you understand blockchain. So that's the idea behind the price movement being tied to the Chinese president's comments. I think it's a combination of that. You've got classic sort of like sideways movement that we've been having for a while. This most recent dip was pretty ferocious, and I think kind of shook out all the weaker hands to where when the price moved upwards, there wasn't a lot of selling pressure there. So this move downward kind of took care of all the bears and removed a lot of the selling pressure there. So when the price moved up, there was a lot of ground to cover in terms of there's a lot less sellers.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, on a day like what we saw on the 25th, 26th, around that time, it's pretty staggering to sort of think that, on that day, on that 24-hour period alone, there was over $50 billion injected into the space, into Bitcoin in just that 24-hour period. And given the current size of the entire crypto markets as a whole, currently around $250 billion, to have a $50 billion jump in just a 24-hour period seems utterly staggering. Now, as you said, how that money came into the market, whether that was a result of fundamentals, whether that was a result of externalities and international geopolitical factors that occurred. What sort of power do you ascribe to the fact that that amount, that's such a significant percentage of the market, can be injected in just one day? Do you think that shows that there are players on the sidelines ready to get in, or do you think that was already internal players just moving money around in an already existing market?
That's a great question. We did see backed volume surge during this huge price upswing. So that does indicate that some institutional money is flowing in. As a percentage of total volume, though, it was very, very small. I do think that this volume is a good indicator that we've kind of seen a lot of the the bear market have been shaken out by now. This is a very large move upside with a lot of volume to indicate that there was a lot of money changing hands on the way up. Which kind of solidifies the price movement was, you could say, not more real, but a little bit more solidified, given that the price was discovered via all this volume all the way up, and that there was a lot of money that changed hands at certain levels. So I think this is incredibly bullish. I think it indicates that Bitcoin's market is very liquid. I know a lot of people talk about Bitcoin being illiquid, but this proves that it is quite liquid, which means that it can attract larger and larger orders. Which makes Bitcoin the most attractive currency of them all, because as Bitcoin's price goes up and more people FOMO in, Bitcoin will be the only one that has the liquidity necessary to take billion-dollar purchases from sovereign wealth funds. So I think Bitcoin survived. I think Bitcoin moving up with this much volume is fantastic. Most of the exchanges didn't have any issues. I believe Alameda Research was the only one that actually had some issues. But the fact that all these exchanges stayed online during this massive price swing, I think is a really good indication that the trading infrastructure is in a good space for another bull run.
Do you think as well, Dan, that a movement of this scale, we're talking peaking out at around 40%, there was a pullback obviously, but peaking out at around that point on a 24-hour timeline, do you think that's healthy for the market? I mean, obviously from a trader's perspective, it's pretty exciting. It gives a lot of rush, boosts a lot of the short-term sentiment sort of in the market. But do you think it's really healthy to climb with such volatility so suddenly and so intensely?
Absolutely. I think Bitcoin's calling card is volatility. Volatility is what you read about in the newspaper. People hear about the volatility, they hear about their friends making money, and that's what attracts them to Bitcoin. As the saying goes, come for the degenerate trading, but stay for the sound money. And that's what has led Bitcoin to grow farther and farther in terms of adoption, is people come in for the speculative bubbles, and then the hodlers and the Bitcoiners, the true believers, stick around. And they stick around until the next bubble. And that's me. I've stuck around from each one to each one because I came because I saw the speculative sort of nature of it, and that attracted me to it. But when I learned more about it, I was like, this is a fundamentally, groundbreaking new social consensus mechanism. So I think that volatility, without volatility, people would have never heard of Bitcoin. If it had stayed at $1, certainly you and I would not be here. And so volatility is a natural, organic thing that will happen with Bitcoin, and it's going to happen throughout the entire duration of its existence. So we should embrace the volatility and not be scared by it.
All right. So now I want to drill down a little bit more into this China development and what it really means, because obviously when Xi Jinping, president of China, president of 1.4 billion people, speaks publicly at a Chinese Communist Party meeting, nonetheless, a meeting of the main government of China, and speaks about blockchain technology, about the potential for blockchain technology, it's going to have weight, it's going to have heft, whether that drove this price surge or not. So you've drawn our attention to a thread coming from Maple Leaf Capital, a Twitter thread talking about this move from China as a fundamental paradigm shift in the way the world looks at blockchain and even potentially at Bitcoin. Can you break down a little bit about your thoughts on this thread and about this China decision as a whole?
Yeah, the Maple Leaf Capital thread was a really brilliant thread. I've never heard of Maple Leaf Capital, but this is what Twitter, I think, is really, really cool. This is what really makes Twitter shine, is these random thoughts that individuals have. They've now propagated that thought out there, and we're able to read about it. So the two takeaways that I got from the thread is that this is the beginning of a larger geopolitical war between different reserve currencies. By digitizing or tokenizing the central bank currency, now central banks will start to compete with different local fiat currencies. And we've heard this narrative before with stablecoins, that a US dollar stablecoin projects the power of the US dollar. And I think the Chinese are realizing that whether you tokenize or digitize the US dollar or RMB, if people can now use that in their local geographies like Argentina or somewhere else, then now you've started to displace local fiat currencies with a stronger fiat currency. While the US dollar and RMB have a whole host of problems, they're still one of the best fiat currencies amongst other fiat currencies. It's kind of like the best of the worst. And so they might use this to exert their influence, which they could exert their influence into the payment infrastructure, to where maybe RMB, they, in local B2B business, settlements, they use RMB instead of their local fiat. So I kind of see this, and Maple Leaf Capital calls this out as the beginning of like central bank warfare, between different, kind of using regions like South America and Africa as a new battleground, but it'll be the battleground for world reserve currency dominance. And so this kind of shocked me because I'd kind of considered this happening sooner than later, but this is really, really soon, and it actually makes a lot of sense. And I thought it was a new kind of refreshing take on how the game theoretic outcome of blockchain tech and Bitcoin will kind of push and pull. And so I thought that was really interesting. And the second part was around, the idea that with the Chinese government saying that citizens should learn about blockchain, that does mean that they will have to learn about Bitcoin. While they heavily censor their internet, they're not going to be able to talk about blockchain without talking about Bitcoin. So I thought that was really interesting as well, is that a certain percentage of the Chinese citizens, even if the government tells them, hey, blockchain is the innovation, not Bitcoin, a certain percentage of them will realize that Bitcoin is the innovation. And so now he's turned the eyes of 1 billion people upon blockchain and Bitcoin. And I think that will fundamentally change the amount of interest and in trading that will occur in the space.
Do you think there's any risk at all? I mean, because the Chinese government has been so avowed up till now on the blockchain, not Bitcoin narrative, do you think there's any risk to Bitcoin from the fact that the Chinese government has such an anti-Bitcoin stance? If that weren't to change, say, and yet there were more awareness to be made, as much power as information being passed to, as you say, a certain percentage of Chinese citizens that are obviously will end up being exposed invariably to Bitcoin, do you think there's any risk that as the Chinese government grows in this field, they'll try and regulate away Bitcoin, or try and take control, for example, of the large mining pool that exists within China itself, where the vast majority of hash power still originates from? Is that at all a risk for Bitcoin? Is that something that anyone should be concerned about?
Well, hypothetically, a lot of hash power resides in China, but we don't have any data to suggest that it does. Miners can operate behind Tor, so there's no way we're going to know their specific geography. We just assume, and I think it's a healthy assumption, that there is a large amount of mining in China. We just don't know how much. And that's due to because there is an oversupply of different Chinese electrical projects, or like power generation projects like hydroelectric dams that have excess capacity. So to be clear, we don't know that a majority of hashing power resides in China, and we hypothetically think that they do. What's the risk of the Chinese government nationalizing an industry? I would say it's very high. But I think the Chinese are probably much more savvy in terms of the power of what they understand, the power of what Bitcoin can bring. I see the Chinese government embracing Bitcoin in the long term, and Russia embracing Bitcoin in the long term, rather than the US government embracing Bitcoin, because both of them have a financial incentive to do so. Bitcoin can threaten the dominance of the US dollar and enable them. It's sort of like the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And so while they may not like Bitcoin and it'll help their citizens get around capital controls, if they embrace it first, then they might have their reserve. Right now, China has purchased their central bank has purchased a lot of gold. So they eventually could start buying Bitcoin and then have their RMB be collateralized or be backed by Bitcoin. So short term, I see them pushing back against Bitcoin. I do think this is a healthier direction this is a healthier move in the right direction. Longer term, I see the sort of game theoretic play here being China and Russia embracing Bitcoin in the next financial downturn.
All right, so then let's take this full circle and circle back to the United States and all this, where the last big move we heard on anything related to digital assets and cryptocurrencies was, of course, the Mark Zuckerberg speaking before Congress about Libra, which in itself was, let's say, not positive for digital assets in the US as a whole and the regulatory space there. This news coming out, obviously China intends to move forward in a number of ways with their digital asset technology. Is the US just going to keep falling further and further behind?
Yeah, well, I think this was really interesting to see how the crypto Twitter and community reacted to, the Facebook versus China news. It was a little bit disappointing to see a lot of people in the cryptocurrency space embrace China's, blockchain endeavor, and kind of use that as a means to go, hey, United States, why aren't you doing this? Again, I really just care about Bitcoin, so I see this through the lens of how it impacts Bitcoin. The China blockchain will not be beneficial for their citizens. It will definitely be a means of control over the population. I look at the silver lining that the population may then learn about Bitcoin and find it. But in its actuality, China's blockchain could be used for evil. So it more than likely will be used to control the citizens and keep them under extreme amounts of censorship and limited sort of function in what they're able to talk about and do. So I'm not necessarily wanting the United States to follow suit and take more control over the economy. Essentially, so the difference between socialism and capitalism is just the amount of control that the government exerts over the population in terms of economic activity. In the United States, with the Federal Reserve and all of the regulatory agencies, they already exert a massive amount of influence over how businesses operate. So I don't think that it's a good idea for the US government to start embracing blockchain technology, because they will more than likely use it for evil. They will more than likely use it to control more and more aspects of our lives. So if the United States were to embrace blockchain technology that was truly free, which the only one is Bitcoin, then I would be more interested. But I highly doubt that's going to happen anytime soon.
It doesn't seem like it's on the cards immediately, let's just say. So I guess we'll have to watch and see how this potential clash of civilizations does end up playing out in the digital asset realm. But in the meantime, Dan Held, I want to thank you so much for joining us again this week for Hodl with Hedl. I look forward to our conversation next week, where hopefully we might have another massive day of surge that we can talk about, or regardless, I'm sure there'll be plenty of news for us to discuss. But in the meantime, stay with us at blocktv.com for all the latest in news and information. I'm Asher Westrop Evans. Thanks for watching.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.